Hey there, Dylan. I'm probably not going to ramp up for another 15 minutes or so. I'm just going to doodle for a bit. Officially, we start at 5:30, but I figured I'd get set up ahead of time anyway. Glad you could make it. Hopefully, we get some people in here in person. Otherwise, I'm just sitting here occupying an 8-person table for no good reason. Well, Dylan, we are working on a character and creature design workshop. Ideally, one that will be informed by people who attend live here at Victory Point Cafe in Berkeley, which was nice enough to host me. But otherwise, I'm probably just gonna draw for a bit, and people can feel free to watch, feel free to ask questions. I'm completely at their service. I would love to be able to sort of walk through some of the process and make demo some things that people are interested in seeing. Given that Victory Point is a gaming cafe, this would very much be tailored towards illustration for tabletop gaming. But Dylan, since you're the current star of the chat, feel free to, if there's anything in particular you want to see, don't hesitate to throw something out. As I said, right now I'm just going to kind of warm up a bit while I wait for some people to hopefully trickle in. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's probably going to be pretty informal this time around. But hopefully the start of the first of many. And let's see, we are monitoring a bunch of different chats across a bunch of different devices today. So if you do ask a question and I'm a little delayed in responding, it's only because I don't have a moderator to help me out tonight. So, I'm going to stop periodically and check for questions, see if anybody has anything they want to chime in with. But I'm not ignoring you, I promise. Unless it's Dylan. I might ignore Dylan. Alright, Dylan, a druid of any race. I'll be sure to work that in. Good call out. All right, well, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and just start talking. So I'm here at Victory Point Cafe, which is very much nice enough to have me. It is a lovely gaming cafe in Berkeley, of which actually my wife and daughter and I are members, which is to say we have gaming cards that we punch every time we come in to try out new tabletop games and things like that. My 4-year-old in particular gets to explore a lot of board games. It's a great strategy for getting to know what she likes before we commit to buying something for the house or trying stuff out that we don't have access to normally. If you're in the Berkeley area, it's a great cafe besides. Great food, great coffee, great place to be, great place to hang out and work. So I would definitely recommend it. Now, why I'm here today, I am here for really a night of just kind of a casual character and creature design workshop. I have a table here open for anyone who cares to join me in person at the cafe. But otherwise, we've got a lot of different avenues for people to join virtually, across YouTube, across Discord. Victory Point has their own Discord, so it's an excellent way to chime in if you care to ask any questions or contribute to the conversation. Otherwise, it's just going to be me shouting into the void, which, I'm used to it. I'll make do. But it sure would be nice to have someone to talk to. Anyway, that being said, so who am I? My name is Evan Winston. I am an illustrator, character designer, visual development artist. These days working primarily in the tabletop RPG and comic book spaces, but I have worked on animated films, I've worked on children's books, I've worked on TV productions, I've worked on commercials for everything from, laundry detergent to electric vehicles before Tesla was even a thing. So yeah, I've been in this field for a long time. Now these days I also am a software engineer by day because I live in San Francisco. So it's almost a rule you have to be. But I still very much keep active as an artist, as an illustrator, and as an art director wherever I can. So that's me. I'm really here to talk about and to demonstrate for anyone who's interested or anyone who wants to see how some of the sausage gets made, as it were, illustrating assets for tabletop RPGs. So these would be characters or creatures, monsters, potentially something like magic items. Battle maps a little bit less so, but that's definitely an option and something we can explore. All the things that make, theater of the mind for tabletop gameplay more engrossing, more enthralling, more interesting, visually at least. That's kind of what I do. And I've been a teacher of both art and coding, so I really like talking about this stuff. I really like sharing the pedagogy of it, the process, the steps I like to take to get to where I'm going. And I find that in the past it's been very, very helpful for up-and-coming artists who are interested in getting their work in front of the eyes of somebody who can give them some, quality critique or give them some direction in terms of how to pursue a career in this space, freelance or otherwise. So yeah, that's my goal. Not ambitious at all, as I sit here talking to myself. But right now I'm just kind of doodling and warming up, and I've got this dwarf character who's feeling a little tall. Actually, I'm feeling like he's a little tall. He's a little narrow-bodied. I tend to prefer my dwarves of the stockier variety, but we'll see how he takes shape. We're just kind of, as I said, we're just warming up. We're just experimenting. No wrong answers here. No wrong ways to solve a design problem. And that's kind of a good place to start, is remembering that all of these decisions that go into illustrating a character, even for something like a tabletop game property, they are exactly that. They're design problems. The design problem to be solved may be different based on your use case, your needs, the IP. but that's exactly what they are, and it's important to remember that. That we're not just doodling to have fun. I mean, right now I am, but it's not why we do what we do. And for those people who do this professionally, it is very much a skill set that they hone, and that they invest themselves in. And if it's something that you're interested in, either as in terms of being a more active consumer or participating in and pursuing yourself, it's important to remember that. It's much like anything else, it is going to be a skill to develop. If you are here to have fun, then I am more than willing to have you, which is to say I want this to be fun and accessible for everybody. I don't mean to take myself too seriously. I definitely do that from time to time. But, yeah, I guess that's it. I just wanted to put that out there, that there is a craft to it that can get overlooked, especially when we're looking at amazing art for Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or anything like that. Speaking of which, I think it is Pathfinder night here at Victory Point Cafe. So if you're coming by for Pathfinder at, I think, 6, and you're a little early, feel free to stop on by. All right, I think I've taken this guy about as far as he can go. I'm pretty happy with him. Maybe I'll give him some gear. He needs some gear. He's a D&D character. He's got to have some kind of gear. So let's give him 2 axes. Because why not? And he'll just be kind of leaning on them casually, as only a Dungeons and Dragons dwarf could do. So I promise to get more into what I'm doing, why I'm doing what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, for anyone who's interested. But right now, as I said, I'm still kind of giving people some time to trickle in. But to preempt a question, I'm working in Procreate, which is an iOS exclusive app. It's only on Apple devices, but it is an incredible drawing application. Fully replaces something like Photoshop, which is kind of the industry standard for someone like me. Depending on your workflow, it might not, but for someone like me, Procreate is an excellent piece of software. It really does everything that Photoshop can do, and then some. And it's just a joy to use. So if anyone out there has an iPad and is just kind of thinking of exploring drawing, or just finds the idea of breaking out your iPad and doodling on the go fun and appealing, then would definitely recommend it. I think it's a $20 purchase price, one time, no subscription, nothing. And they've shown themselves up to now to be a really awesome company, really supportive of their community. So, would definitely give them some flowers anywhere I can. All right, now he's got axes. Let's also give him a backup sword, because why not? He doesn't look like someone who arrives for a conflict unprepared. And once I wrap him up, maybe he's someone we can come back to and take to the next stage, which would be kind of a cleanup and some value choices, black and white, and turn to color. Can really bring him to a nice polish. Or I'll keep going and explore some different character concepts. Okay, I think that's probably a decent place for him. Another strap across his chest. Doesn't look like he's wearing much by way of armor, which is pretty undwarf-like, but I'm going to roll with it for now, because I don't want to get bogged down on my first character of the night. Right, there we go. We have a dwarf. I'm just going to move him to the side, leave him there for the time being, and we'll get working on something else. My idea here... Hey, Dylan, let's see. Do you have a recommendation for the best stylist when getting started digitally. So I'm assuming you mean like what kind of style to pursue, art style. I mean, I have plenty of inspirations that I could throw out there, and would love to give props to, but starting like the first thing that I would want to address is, if you're really just getting started, if you don't have a whole lot of confidence in your drafting skills, your drawing and things like that, I would actually avoid getting bogged down in the idea of style just yet. Your own style is going to come naturally over time with mileage. As boring an answer as that is, it's too easy to use style as a crutch, especially in the early days. A lot of people up and coming, or a lot of younger artists, they'll start out sort of drawing the characters that they really love from comics, from anime, from TV shows, and that's great. I am in no way suggesting you don't do that, but by leaning on that as sort of your skills development regimen, and again, I'm separating this from just drawing to have fun. If you're trying to have fun and enjoying it, you do you. Don't let me stop you. That's all this should be about. But if the idea is to sort of develop that skill set to a point where you could pursue it as a profession, or where you want to see your skills improve to rival those of your art heroes, then it's important to not grab hold of style and use that too heavily as a skills development routine in the early days. The reason for that is the best thing that you can do for your visual library and your instincts in solving design problems and challenges is draw from life. Whether that's photo reference or going outside and with a sketchbook. That is going to build your visual Rolodex, as I said. It's going to give you the right instincts and mental model with which to solve problems that are already solved by artists who have a very strong and unique style. Style is really just a collection of problem-solving decisions that have been made over time in order to reduce something that is realistic into something that is more indicative of realism. Something that achieves that illusion of life without actually giving you all of the visual information. Okay, I am going to just keep drawing right now, because that was a lot. That was a word salad. So let's see, what am I going to work on next? So, Dylan, you said a druid of any race. I can start there. Let's see. Okay. How about, well, I started with a dwarf. Let's move on to, let's try an elf. So as with any drawing or design, the very first thing I like to start with are just very basic shapes, gestural shapes. Now in drawing like a full figure and character, I just lean hard into gesture drawing. So those would be just like lines of action for the body, establishing a sense of weight, and a very, very general roadmap for how this character's posing is going to be. And posing can be a challenge in and of itself. It's a big one. But for something like tabletop RPGs in particular, these are not going to be animated characters for the most part. So they don't need to be designed for animation. There's a lot of definitely unique decisions that go into that particular aspect of the process. Which means that something like posing, silhouette, staging are really, really critical for selling the idea of the character on very first read. A character should have really, really clear visual identity right off the bat. You should be able to look at them and determine what they are, especially in the kind of IP where characters are very heavily defined by classes. You should be able to look at a character and determine, oh, that's a paladin, or oh, that's obviously a rogue. Obviously, there are some multi-class options, once you get into like a level 20 characters narrative, they can have unique items and appearances and modifications that can make them look any which way the players would like. So there's only so far you can take that rule, but certainly for something like a source book, if you're doing an illustration for a new subclass or a homebrewed monster, you want it to have a very, very clear idea of what it is right out the gate. So let's see. This is going to be a druid. I'm a little ambivalent as to what's happening here, but let's say they're communing with a little birdie friend. Classic druid stuff. I feel like I've drawn this character before. I probably have. It's at this point it's hard to starting from a blank page just completely bust out with an idea I haven't at least skirted with before. But it's always a fun experiment. So yeah, I like to start with the very basic gestural shapes, and this is it. And this is a good point to sort of take a step back, take a look at where we are, take a look at what needs to be adjusted. Right now I feel like their legs are pretty short. There we go. Feels a little bit better. Their weight is... I'm not crazy about how their feet are planted right now, so I'm going to go ahead and adjust that. A little bit. There's definitely going to be a lot of anatomy problem solving that goes into some of the later stages. This knee is definitely not crazy about it. Anyway, at the very early gesture stage, we get a basic roadmap of the character. Nothing crazy, nothing too specific, not getting into detail too early, because this is the point where it's easy to make changes. I can definitely do more with that leg, which isn't carrying a lot of the weight too. Especially with something like an elf, where the character should feel very dynamic, very graceful, physically graceful. I like kind of pushing that posing a bit to really suggest a bit more. And so I'm probably going to be pushing and pulling this for a while. Or I could be. I'm going to try not to. Yeah, let's rein this in a little bit before I get too bogged down by it. So I'm really just trying to establish a visual statement that feels like it works to me. So this character's kind of... I've got to adjust the torso. It's just not working for me here. I'm going to just completely turn them, frankly. Okay. I'm kind of reversing on a lot of the touchstones that I'd set for myself, but that's fine because this is actually the best time to do it. Alright, so this is good. This is what I'm going to call it. We have a basic roadmap for a character. An interesting pose, not particularly appealing, but we'll see what we can do to dress them up. And yeah, we'll just start developing them from here. Once we have that roadmap in, it gives us everything that we need as far as the important landmarks of anatomy. So I'm going to go ahead and demarcate pretty clearly lines of the hips, lines of the shoulders. We can see where the major joints happen. It gives us a roadmap to follow as we then go back in, whether it's with a darker pencil or a darker charcoal, or in this case, right on top with darker lines, or if you have a light box and you pop another sheet of paper on top of this, tracing paper. The idea here is to then build on this armature. And so from here, I can start laying in more detail with regards to the anatomy, but I'm going to go ahead and dig into the face a little bit. And I'm very much informed by things like animation. So if that comes across, especially in the earlier iterations of a lot of these characters, well, it should. That's the idea. But for a lot of people who think of Dungeons and Dragons art and they say, "What? That's extremely different. That's not what I expect from a lot of my fantasy art. I expect gritty Dragonlance characters and super feminine female characters and a sense of realism that animation doesn't necessarily carry." I would say that, it's really just a part of my process, and animation represents a sort of halfway point in this case. It doesn't have to, but that kind of aesthetic, what we see here, for instance, is a really great building block for me to establish the energy and movement of a character before pursuing things like hyperrealism and sort of losing some of that energy, which tends to naturally happen as you work a sketch to death. So it's that gesture, that line of action, keeping things loose and sort of impressionistic in this way is a good way for me to sort of lock all of that in, or as much of it in as I can, before it all gets sucked out by trying to render everything. And we're not going to make it that far into a sketch tonight, to the point where it's really rendered, but I am butchering this face. I'm not liking this face. I'm going to start over. So I'm really just pushing and pulling those decisions that I'd made earlier at this point. Hey, Casey. Let's see. Talking about how you're inspired by animation rather than the look of D&D art really makes me feel relieved, because I feel like my art is inspired by that as well. Yeah, it's not it's definitely not a negative, first of all, and it's not exclusionary either. Animators are expert designers at what they, not to suggest that non-animators aren't, but the kinds of problem-solving decisions that go into character design for animation and things like that lend themselves really well to even more realism-inspired fantasy and sci-fi art. So the notion that you're either one or the other is more harmful than good. So I wouldn't worry about that so much. I've decided that this is probably a female, so I'm kind of lightening up her frame a little bit to sell that a little bit more. The face is still really, really loose. I'm not really convinced by it, but there's some things there that I like, some shapes that I am going to try to lean into, but I'm going to try and pay some attention to the rest of the body before I overcommit to one area. It's really easy to spend, an hour on one part of a character, and then you take a step back and realize, oh, wow, I still have a ton of other things that haven't gotten done yet, and now nothing kind of meshes with anything else. It all feels all over the place. It's really, really easy to do. So it's important. To me, it's important in the early days, in the early stages, to kind of keep yourself moving across the canvas. Every time I forget how hard it is to talk and draw at the same time. She looks kind of soporific. I'm gonna go with it. And she's going to be barefoot because she's a druid. Not barefoot, she's going to be in strappy shoes. And so that's the other thing, especially given that I tend to lean into the more animation aesthetic, it can feel like I lean on that kind of silliness, for lack of a better word. I don't think silliness is the appropriate word, but it's a relatable one, I think, for this idea. It's easy to feel like I lean too heavy into that silliness sometimes, but it's really, again, just one stop on the road towards a fully realized and appealing character. A lot of this that feels maybe out of place for a D&D character will potentially get bled away as I render her out, especially if I were to take her to a full paint. I mean, if we were going to do something like that, you'll see a lot of my fully painted characters, they start in a very, very similar fashion, and they feel silly, again, for lack of a better term. But they don't stay that way. That's not how they develop. So if you find that, your character design leans on something that doesn't feel like it belongs in the genre you're working in, maybe ask yourself, why do you feel that way? For me, animation is a really universal design language that can easily turn into anything you need for a given project. It can easily inform photorealism if you're working on concept art for a AAA video game. It can easily inform animation for television, obviously. Then you need to work in design for things like puppet animation, by which I mean something like Bob's Burgers. That's a form of puppet animation or paper cutout animation, different ways to refer to it. See, even that, just kind of like changing the shape of her jawline from this very, very simplistic curve to giving just a little bit more definition of a chin, it goes a long way towards making her feel more grounded and out of that animation aesthetic towards a character who could be more fully realized. She's not there yet, but we can get her there. Alright, she feels pretty crunchy granola. She feels pretty Berkeley, which I feel happy with, given that I'm in Berkeley. Um, so I won't work on her too much more. I think the dwarf is definitely a much stronger character. If this were for a contract, I'd like to spend a lot more time troubleshooting her, as it were, and figuring out the best way to move forward with her. But let me just do a little more anatomy definition for her arms, her hands especially. The hands are a really key element in character staging for me. For something like an elf, you go for the long and nimble fingers, the graceful hands, graceful everything, really. Although on that note, I do really like to explore character ideas that sort of challenge that mold. There aren't a whole lot of older looking or heavy set elves in a lot of medieval pop culture, not medieval, fantasy pop culture. And I like to kind of explore those less explored corners where I can. But again, if we're talking about like general, easily recognizable appeal, those are kinds of the things that evoke an elf over a dwarf or a human, say. Whereas the dwarf, he's got much larger fingers. There's a lot more we could do with that, but I'm going to keep it moving. My goal here is really quantity over quality in this case, since this is a demo and AMA. I'm kind of working blind and trying to get as much out as I can, and show you all, sort of the process that I go through, what it entails, and be available for any questions. All right, let's see, Casey. Thank you. Feels like you gave me the permission that I was looking for. Yeah, of course, definitely. All right, I'm gonna call it on her. Yeah. Not crazy about her, but there's your druid, Dylan. There you go. I'm gonna hide her. There, done. New character. Let's see what's gonna be next. Anyone have any ideas? Anyone want to throw something out? What do you want to see? I have no one at the table with me. How about, I like drawing the little people, little folk a lot, so gnomes, hobbits, dwarves. Let's try a gnome or hobbit. How about that? Tell me, gnome or hobbit? Not hobbit, halfling. I'm sorry. Excuse me, Tolkien estate. Actually, Pathfinder, they're hobbits, aren't they? Maybe not. Thank you, Dylan. So again, I'm just kind of laying in a very loose landmarks. I have an idea for posing, which is incredibly important in these kinds of character illustrations. The dwarf is actually a very static pose. He's got a lot going on. I think he's got a lot of character and personality, but he's pretty static. For this, I'm going to refer to them as okay, gnome. Thanks, Dylan. As a gnome, this gnome, pointed ear then, is, I'm going for something, for a little bit more dynamic of a pose. So they're kind of, like, contorting their body, looking in this direction. We're going to be seeing a bit of their back, I think. And let's see where this takes us. And I'll try to make some more actionable call-outs here for, as far as like character design goes, in lieu of any questions. I also don't want to shame people for not asking questions. Don't beat yourself up trying to fill my own paralyzingly, what's the word? Insecure silence, cone of silence here. That leg's not working. Too far. Better. So that kind of sense of weight right there is the kind of thing that I can respond to. I can look at it and say that doesn't feel right, only because I've drawn however many figures that I've drawn. That only because I've observed how the human body distributes weight, however many times. Only because I have built that visual Rolodex. So if, for instance, you took a look at that and, hey, it looked fine, you're not sure why I erased it, nothing wrong with that. It just is an indicator that, that's one of those kinds of instincts that will come with time as you, devote yourself to spending time drawing from life and observing how a figure moves and all that good stuff. Arms are a little long. Let's instead... Yeah, I'm going to elongate her torso. Her arms are feeling a little long to me. Even though she's a gnome, I'm just going to give her a little bit more... Yeah, okay. That works. So I'm kind of darkening up my lines because I'm starting to lose some of the cleanliness that I need to really build on them. And that's really all that the build-up process is. I remember the first time an old client saw me drawing, they were like, wait, why are you drawing on top of your drawing? Isn't that it? And I'm like, no, that's like, those are my scratch notes. That's my outline, if you would. You don't just sit down and bust out, a beautiful piece. Or if you do, it's a happy accident. That's not a process on which to rely. It's not a process that will get you to where you want to be artistically. It's not reliable. You can't just expect to... You can't just expect to sit down and draw an amazing picture every single time. It's A, way too much pressure to put on yourself. B, extremely unrealistic. What that means is not, if you mess up, it's fine. It is fine, of course. But what I'm really getting at is you can build and establish a process, a routine, steps to follow to more reliably create an appealing character anytime you care to sit down and do so. It may not be your best work every time. I would be extremely surprised if that were the case. And you will still have failures, but you will have a process to rely on, and that's really the way to approach upskilling in terms of art. A lot of people I see just kind of lean on this idea of inspiration. And inspiration is great when it happens, but even when it doesn't, you still got to be able to draw. And so that's a lot of the pressure that sort of figuring out a way forward, even when there is no obvious way forward, can help alleviate. Not liking how straight this arm is. So I'm going to redo it. Casey and Dylan are getting to know each other. Glad to know something good is coming out of this. For those of you who aren't familiar, or all two of you, yeah. For those of you who are not familiar with my work, I do a lot of work and art direction for Gold Mountain Games. It's one of my most recent and prolific TTRPG clients right now. And Casey will be joining us very shortly as one of our contributors. So super excited about that. Super excited to get to work with you more, Casey. very glad you could join us tonight. All right. Arms are still feeling a little long, but you know what? I'm gonna go with it. I do like my gnomes to feel proportionally less like true little people and more like the small half-sized magical creatures that they're meant to be. So yeah, I can go with that. Again, if this were something like an established project with an established visual identity, that would be the kind of thing that you would want to double check with, say, an art director. You don't just kind of make decisions like that on the fly and change the visual language of a property just because. But again, this is kind of a performative doodle session, so why not? Let's do what we can do. Let's see where it takes us. That makes me feel better. Okay, and then costuming. When it comes to costuming, it's very easy to go overboard and find yourself adding a lot of detail just for the sake of it. Detail is great, but so is visual rest. It's just as much an element that you should lean on in determining how your viewer's eye is going to be led through a piece, what you want them to take away from a piece, how chaotic you want a piece to feel. For instance, in the dwarf here, we've got a fair amount of visual density here and then visual rest here, or visual rest in his arm. I imagine this as just being kind of like a white cotton burlap colored material versus the dark of this quilted bit of armor there. It constitutes a value shift and a shift in density, and it gives you a kind of rhythm that you can sort of follow throughout the piece. It creates a nice, appealing visual flow, and it can offer some fun surprises or some fun visual balances and imbalances for your viewers. I know that doesn't sound like a really actionable piece of advice, but the best way to approach that is to find yourself starting to think about things like values and textures and density and how they relate to one another throughout your piece, even at these early stages. Now, where's she looking? She's going to look over here. Let's bring these over. Her torso is too contorted. That's what I'm seeing here. I'm gonna bring this arm in some more. And let's bring this leg in. So this can feel like cheating, the digital aspects of what I'm doing right now. But I would encourage you to think of them as ways to avoid the drudgery of, say, redrawing her from start. If you find yourself leaning too heavily on tools like that, always ask yourself, could I redraw this if I had to, if I had all the time in the world or were working traditionally? So for me, the answer is yes. Right now, this is the best stage to push and pull. So tools like this are really helpful for me for establishing the right visual statement before committing and going into things like detail. I can definitely appreciate how digital tooling can feel like an unearned shortcut. But I would, there are healthy ways to lean on digital tools, and there are unhealthy ways to lean on them. If you find yourself avoiding work for the sake of it because you don't want to do it, probably not the right reason. If you find yourself avoiding a tedious step that you've already done 1,000 times in order to be more efficient, that can be different. If you find yourself avoiding learning, there's a lot of value in having to redraw a character, especially if you're interested in animation. Drawing a given character again and again and again and again, and keeping them on model is an extremely critical skill for things like animation or comic art. So there's definitely a time and a place for challenging yourself. No, I'm not going to use the distort tool. I'm not going to use any selections. I'm not going to use any of that stuff. I'd say a place to not make that decision is when you're live streaming. All right, let's see. Casey, you're so jazzed. Thanks for the shout out. Can't wait. Absolutely. You kidding me? Dylan, talking about Rob. Yep, Rob is great. Rob, if you're watching this in the recording, I hope your ears are burning. All right, so we have the makings of a small gnome rogue, I would say. I'll try to fill out her costuming a bit, maybe. But I think we get the idea as to where she could go. And where we could take her. Yeah, really not crazy about her posing at all, actually. Kind of regretting some of my decisions, but that's going to happen. 2 for 2 is not great, but let me see if I can bring it back around. So let's see, what's bothering me? It's that contortion. She's feeling like... yeah. Okay. And let's try to balance her out a little bit more. I'm not liking just how sparse she's feeling. We've got a big old triangular silhouette happening, which I'm digging, especially for a rogue, so I'm going to go ahead and lean into that. Nice big cape. Alright. Okay, I'll buy that for $1. Any RoboCop fans? Alright, 2 decent character concepts here. Something I do like to kind of shout out whenever I'm talking into a void is the distinction between what most people think of as concept art and what concept art actually is. Most people, they see any kind of art from, say, a video game pipeline, and they default to concept art, and that's deliberate. There's a lot of marketing that has been put into that, but really a lot of that is either key art, which is far more finished story art and illustrations, or promotional art, where it's a fully finished, rendered, polished illustration exclusively for promotional and marketing purposes. That's as distinct from concept art, which really is just a communication of a visual idea. So a lot of concept art is actually really boring. It's things like, prop cutaways. What does this brazier look like from the other side? Or what does it look like if you cut it down the middle and we had to see what it was made of? What does this character's backpack contain? Even though we're never going to see it in the game, let us see it so we get a better idea of who this character is. And all of that, it can be fun, don't get me wrong, and it can be super interesting. I really like that kind of stuff. But it's not always the most visually interesting or compelling in the way that like a big old splash illustration, of a cityscape with basically this image of every video game ever. And there's God rays somewhere, and maybe there's a castle here. It's not as compelling or inherently interesting as this image when it is completely polished and finished up. Understandably so. So I like to disabuse anyone who will listen to me on top of my soapbox of the notion that concept art is always going to look like that. Because it doesn't. It is often quite more mundane, or rather, the art isn't mundane, but it deals with some of the more mundane aspects of the design process that you don't necessarily consider, but that are critical for those production pipelines. A 3D modeler for a character needs to know exactly what that backpack is going to look like, how its weight is on a character, if it's not like a traditional school backpack, or if it is even. They may need that information, and they may need that information visually represented in some way that they can make use of when modeling. They need a full turnaround of a character in a perfect T-pose, which is definitely not the most interesting pose. It's not, more involved or dynamic or staged poses as you might see for a tabletop RPG illustration. Okay, let's see. I'm going to try to size her down so she feels a little more appropriately sized relative to the dwarf. Because dwarves are a little bit bigger than gnomes and halflings, so yeah, we'll go with that. Alright, I'm happy with these two. Let's see if I can do... Let me check the time. 6:11. I'm going to do one more. Maybe two. I don't know. We'll see. I'm going to do another tall person, relatively speaking. Alright, so we got a dwarf, we got a gnome, we got questions. No, we got no questions. Let me check the Discord. No questions. Alright, cool. Full freedom. Well, you know what? We got two decent characters. Maybe I'll paint one of them out instead. I would have loved to dig a little bit more into process, but, if we are where we are and, nobody wants to sort of break that down, I can certainly do a more formal recording, walking through the things that I think about when putting together a character, but it might be fun to see one of these brought to a little bit more of a finish, just a little bit more. In the interim, why don't we take a break and we'll look at some of the stuff that I'm talking about with regards to, completed work. So here's a very, very loosely rendered fly-like creature. This was for 13 Days of Halloween, which was just about a painting of a monster in as many days. It was more like 10 paintings in 13 days, but it was enough. It was enough. This is actually really loosely rendered, and I just kind of want to call out that a lot of the indication of detail is exactly that. It's really just very, very loose indication. There's not a whole lot of photorealism. There's not a whole lot of expressive detail. It is expressive, but not in terms of hyper rendering. A lot of this is just visual gibberish. but it, wait, Goliath Bard. Good call out. I'll bear it in mind. A lot of this is really just controlled indication in order to give the impression or illusion of detail. I mean, this is a pretty loose one. Let's find one that's a little bit more polished. Here's a little bit further, a little bit, I would consider it, say, the next stage of rendering. A little bit more detail here. There's still quite a bit of looseness. There's still a lot of unfinished rough marks and mark making. And really the goal of this, what I'm showing you, is to not make you afraid of leaning away from hyper rendering everything. Especially for artists who are kind of interested in this space. They get really pulled by a ton of detail. And they'll often lean into the idea of hyper rendering every single thing they can in a given image. And often to the exact same degree across the entire image. And it's not going to make for a compelling composition. It's not going to lead your viewer's eye on like a pleasing, appealing, and interesting and surprising journey through your piece. And more importantly, it's not actually how our eyes really see. If you focus on any one thing, it'll be super hyper detailed. You'll see it in full resolution, such as it is. But what we fail to notice is that as our vision moves away from our point of focus, it actually blurs. It blurs away. We lose detail. It falls off. And so one of the biggest rules of thumb for sort of plus one-ing any given painting or composition is to be selective with your detail, to exercise a hierarchy of detail. So where is there a lot of detail in a piece like this? The eyes, maybe a bit the nose and the lips, but I mean, look at the ear. The ear is mud. The ear is absolute mud. The hair is just absolute mud. I mean, they're big, chunky brush strokes, which I like to do and I like to respond to, but altogether, the more precise control of where the detail falls and where it doesn't gives a more organic impression of life-likeness, if that makes sense. If I had hyper-rendered every aspect of this portrait here, it would feel jarring. It would feel... something would feel off. It would at best feel uncanny, like, watching the Polar Express. It wouldn't feel right. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's not how our eyes actually see. And so when we're dealing with just rendering with brushwork, that's an important detail to remember. It's an important thing to consider. I should organize this stuff sometime. The same goes, frankly, let me get away from painting for a minute. The same goes, frankly, for more line-based design. So, for instance, what's a good one? So here's just kind of a fun piece I was working on for my niece. In this case, the idea of hierarchy is just as important, but in this case, the ideas are more shape hierarchy and detail hierarchy. There's a ton of detail, or density of detail, rather, on the girl riding the dinosaur, less so on the dinosaur. There's big empty spaces of blank forms of color, of blank blocks of color. There's big flat areas, and that's in very controlled counterpoint to the much denser detail of the girl. This is a really rough sketch, pardon me, but that's the idea. And that same principle holds for something like values. If we look at any given painting in black and white, let me find a good one. How about Trillium? Oh, so many. So here's one of my goblins. If we take a look at this piece in black and white, the same exact principle is at play for value control and value shifts. So the values here, they pop most most clearly with the highest degree of contrast where I want you to look. So, for instance, I'm at my maximum number of layers. Of course I am. So, for instance, Chill's eye. There's a very, very harsh black, almost, that is in severe counterpoint to the light of their pupil. The sclera in the pupil is a big old point of contrast. The dark under the brim of that hat against the light of their brows catching the light coming from above, big old counterpoint. Same for the contrast between the ear and the dark of the background. All of this is to suggest or to say that the kind of hierarchy that you bear in mind, where you're going to distribute your highest point of contrast, where you're going to distribute your highest density of detail, where you're going to distribute your highest saturation of chroma. Maybe that's how you do it. You keep your saturation really, really high. Your color's super vibrant where you want someone to look, and as they look away, those colors desaturate. All of these are important design decisions and considerations in putting together a composition. Hey, we got a halfling that I need to finish sometime. She was fun. All right, I'm going to get back to our sketches. And let's try to fill these guys in with some value a little bit, just to sort of demonstrate what I mean, and in that sense anyway. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to knock back the value of the background, because I hate looking at white, especially on a screen. It can really kill your eyes over time. I also like it. I like working on toned paper a lot if I'm working traditionally. And I like kind of evoking that in as part of my process digitally as well. I'm going to be a little loose here for the sake of brevity. But right now, I'm just kind of going to fill them in with a solid block of color, or gray, rather. And I'm going to paint on top of that and try to establish a value map for these guys. And by values, for anyone who's not familiar with the term, it just means black and white. The rule there is value is 1,000% more important than color. No matter what your final intention, your ultimate intention for a piece is in terms of the color involved, the values that you lay in and determine are far, far, far more important, are going to contribute more to the success of your image, the appeal of your image. They're going to contribute far more to what your image accomplishes than your color choices. So that is something to consider. And speaking of color, I saw that you asked a question on color, Casey. I will take a look at that in a minute. Let me just wrap this block in up. It's getting louder in here. I think Pathfinder is going to pick up. Unless I'm making that up and it's not Pathfinder Night, which is entirely possible. I don't really know. I haven't looked up for an hour, so honestly, there could be someone at the table and I wouldn't have noticed. I feel like they would have said something, though. Maybe not. It's Berkeley. Berkeley's weird. I like Berkeley. I love Berkeley. I lived in Berkeley. Don't hate me, Berkeley. Berkeley knows it's weird. It's probably fine. Okay. That'll do it. Okay, Casey, your question was, how do you pick your colors when you're painting? Okay. The way I pick my colors when I'm painting is with values. So I feel like this lends itself really well to what we're doing. So I've blocked these in, and this is really just part of the digital workflow. I'm going to go ahead and paint on a clipping mask, which Just like Photoshop or anything else, all that means is I can't color outside the lines, and this just makes it way faster to lay in some quick value choices. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start making some dark and light choices for these folks. So let's start with maybe a skin tone. Skin tone. And much of this may be adjusted as we go, as I see how these value choices play against one another. Ear. And let's go for a darker skin tone for the gnome. That's another thing I think is worth calling out. There's, I mean, Wizards of the Coast has been really great about this lately. Don't get me wrong. A lot of companies have. But there is a historical lack of diversity in fantasy art and illustration. So if you do find yourself going into that space, let's help that. Let's make that better, because it doesn't have to be that bad. All right, and that's honestly, let's go darker. Let's not. I don't have time. I will. This will be good for her hair, though. It's a darker hair color. So she's kind of got that windswept side of her head shaved kind of look, because she's a rogue. Why not? She's awesome. Let's start laying in some tones for clothing. Chairs here are loud. Just basic tones. Give myself a baseline. And most importantly, I'm thinking about where I can incorporate some nice value shifts. Just like, this leather jerkin against the light of this dwarf's shirt or tunic. My wife would be making fun of me for knowing those terms. But that's okay. I'm in Berkeley. And then we can go a little bit darker for the quilted. I said it and then I forgot what this is called. The quilted thing around his waist, and some of the leather accents in his costuming. Okay. So we've got value shifts in the dwarf. We go from dark to light to dark to medium to very light. So the value shifts give some nice interest. They give some nice variation. They give us a nice jumps that can make for an appealing journey through the character. But we still have our lightest color here against a neutral that is different enough so as to create a significant enough contrast that this value jump is not competing with this value jump where I want you to look. If his beard were a lot lighter, actually even if his beard were a lot lighter, if he had like a full-on white beard, that would still be a really significant point of contrast against, this is a ridiculous white, it would still be a significant enough point of contrast against his jerkin, such that our point of focus is still his face, the most psychologically critical part of the piece. But if, say, his jerkin here were, a lighter color, something like this, a lighter value, pardon me, something like this, we now risk imbalancing the visual flow, because yes, his skin tone is significantly lighter than his beard, but we then have this large, indiscriminate, in terms of value, area that gets kind of visually confusing. And honestly, it's close enough now to the sleeve of the shirt that it's this huge bit of real estate where the values kind of blend together. We don't want that. So, Casey, the first step in answering your question is how I start by thinking about color. The answer is by thinking in black and white. It is something I would always recommend. Your values are always going to be more important than your color. Okay, so I mean, I think he's in a decent enough spot as far as an indication of what his value map is going to look like. Again, I'm not trying to make everything perfect. I'm not trying to make all of the decisions yet, but I am trying to make the bulk of the decisions so that those are too dark. I don't like those that dark. So that from here on out, the decision-making process becomes easier. I can adapt more fluidly to it. So we've got our dwarf and then our gnome. Let's see. Well, she's a rogue, so probably a lot of darks for her, but I want to give her at least one really nice pop of value where it is important. So I'm going to think about that. Obviously, you know, her sclera are going to help draw attention to her face in a way that the sort of squinty-eyed dwarf is not going to benefit from. So I actually don't need to worry too much about ensuring her face is highly visible as a point of contrast. And maybe it's a good opportunity to put a really stark light on these dagger blades. You know, she is a rogue after all. Maybe we want those blades to really stand out and serve as, you know, a bit of a statement in her character. They're not as psychologically important as the face, but at the same time, the psychological importance of like a character's face is almost a given that you can rely on sometimes, which is to say we're going to look for it. We always, as humans, look for the face. We also have the advantage of her eyes helping to inherently help her face pop against her skin tone. And so maybe I'm going to try to use that and see if I can add just a little bit more emphasis to those dagger blades to suggest something about her character or her methodology or her, you know, just give you that little extra bit of visual information on that first read to take away with you. Because, you know, you see a little person, a little petite person, and maybe, you know, they're non-threatening. Even her face is non-threatening. Her pose isn't exactly threatening, but then she's holding these big chunky daggers. Maybe that is the kind of visual distinction, what's the word I'm looking for, the kind of visual friction that she could benefit from. Her character design could benefit from. And that's really it. So from here, Casey, if I were to take her to a full paint, these approaches to value, I'm going to pump up her cape too, because that really serves as a nice visual break between this part of her body and the rest of her body. It gives you this nice little jump in between two darks. And obviously, if the line work were cleaner, if we were really taking this to a finish, it would have a much greater visual weight than it does. Anyway, the next step for going into color, Casey, is I would always try to check my color choices against this value map. I would always try to be true to it, because it's really, really easy, especially if you're dealing with super complex chromas like red or like a super saturated green. They can really fool your impression of light and dark, of value. So it's important to check your work constantly against your original value map or your value thumbnail, even better. If you're in the habit of creating thumbnails, which I'd always recommend, making value thumbnails is always going to be a really useful exercise in getting to a more clear composition and a more effective composition. All right, let's see. It is 6:33. So I've been at this for about an hour. Well, what I will say is, Casey, just to kind of finish off this point, as you're working on a painting, as you're working on a given piece, it's always a good idea to, whether you're working in like Photoshop or Procreate, or even if you're working traditionally, look, I already have one. We have a layer that is set to color mode, and it's just filled with black. And if I turn it on, it immediately converts the work into full value. So it allows me to check my values and make sure that my hierarchies of value are intact. So in this case, we've got a pretty primary point of contrast, and we've got maybe, arguably 2 secondary points of contrast, which give you a really important first read. It's really hard to miss that dragon. And then a similarly important but less important second read, which gives you the full moon, which is really a motif, and the Dreadlord here with his big highlighted sword. Their big highlighted sword, forgive me. Okay, back to our characters. I hope nothing in there is proprietary. And so ideally, this is a good point where I would start refining the lines and cleaning them up. You can see this in sort of the approach to comic work. If we look at, for instance, how my sketches often start to how they finish, this is the point where I would take this line work and I would just kind of lower the opacity, and I would draw on top of it and come up with that greater definition that brings me to a clear, readable finish, like this. But I'm going to skip that because we don't have a whole lot of time. So we've got our value statements for these characters. Now's a good time. You can start coming in and establishing things like, giving them a little bit more character. Let's make his nose, that big old nose, and that ear a little bit ruddier. He's a dwarf after all. What is a dwarf without a ruddy nose? Ruddy, not runny. Easy sources of appeal are adding that same kind of ruddiness to fingers. It's all element of subsurface scattering, areas of the body where the blood is closer to the surface of the skin is thinner. Things like the nose, things like where the blood flow is increased in your fingers. It contributes to a redder skin tone in some of these zones. And doing that, even with characters of darker skin tone, although there are other things to consider often when you're dealing with different skin tones, rather than just, make it darker. There are other considerations. But doing these kinds of things can contribute really dramatically to an illusion of life with very minimal effort. Like, again, this is still really, really loose, but even just, giving that bit of tone in the cheeks and the ears and the nose, it goes a long way towards adding some character to this character. All right, well, shall I keep drawing? Shall I keep painting? What am I going to do here? Any votes? Any ideas? Goliath Bard? That would be a fun one, wouldn't it? No problem, Casey. I hope it's helpful. We'll certainly have more opportunity to work closely together on that as you work on the drive-through pipeline. So we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about that. Well, everyone, thank you for joining. I think I'm probably going to call it here. And, I'll wrap it up. I appreciate everyone who was able to join. I hope this is helpful for anyone who chooses to watch the recording in future. If anyone would like to see more of this kind of stuff, don't hesitate to let me know. I'm sure I'll be back at Victory Point again sometime in the future, and I would love to do one of these with more live attendees and get people involved. If anyone out there is an artist in the Berkeley area and wants to come by and talk shop or bring your work for a critique or anything like that, please don't hesitate to do so. And still in an event, sorry guys. Yeah, I'm almost done now. I'll be out of here in a few minutes. That's my cue. All right, everybody. Thanks again. I hope this was of interest. Don't hesitate to reach out and let me know if you'd like to see more of this stuff in the future. Bye, everybody.